In 1994, he sat at the table where Cuba policy was made. Not as an observer, not as a junior staff member taking notes in the back of the room, as the senior director for Inter-American Affairs on the White House National Security Council, the specific person responsible for advising the President of the United States on American policy toward Cuba, toward Latin America, toward the region that Cuba's government considered its strategic neighborhood and whose developments it monitored with existential urgency. Victor Manuel Rocha, codename BUHO, meaning owl in Spanish, the name Cuba's General Directorate of Intelligence had given him more than 20 years earlier, was inside the room where American Cuba policy was decided, advising on strategy, reading the classified assessments, understanding what the United States knew and didn't know, what it was considering and why, what diplomatic moves it was weighing, and what intelligence was shaping those choices. For the Cuban intelligence service he was secretly serving, the year Victor Rocha spent on the National Security Council represented something that 4 decades of patient cultivation had been designed to produce: complete access to the policy process at its most consequential moment, not after decisions were made and reported, before, in the room, at the table. He has since told a federal court, via a guilty plea in April 2024, that he served Cuba for 40 years. The FBI's undercover operation, in which an agent posing as a Cuban intelligence handler met with Rocha multiple times in Miami between 2022 and 2023, produced recorded conversations in which Rocha described his service as more than a grand slam against the United States, in which he called Cuba the island and referred to Fidel Castro as El Comandante, in which he used one word, a specific, unambiguous, deliberately chosen word, to describe the country he had represented as an ambassador, that had employed him for 21 years as a diplomat, and whose most sensitive policy discussions he had participated in at the NSC level. The enemy. The United States. The enemy. Said by the man who had sworn an oath as a naturalized citizen in 1978, signed his State Department employment agreement in 1981, accepted the national security clearances that gave him access to America's most sensitive foreign policy deliberations, and represented the United States as ambassador to Bolivia from 2000 to 2002. On April 12, 2024, Victor Manuel Rocha, 73, of Miami, Florida, pleaded guilty in the Southern District of Florida to conspiring to act as an illegal agent of the Cuban government. Judge Beth Bloom imposed the sentence immediately. The statutory maximum, 15 years in federal prison, plus a $500,000 fine. She had one thing to say to him: Victor Manuel Rocha, you turned your back on this country. Attorney General Merrick Garland called it one of the highest-reaching and longest-lasting infiltrations of the United States government by a foreign agent in American history. One of the highest-reaching, one of the longest-lasting. Let's build what those two descriptions actually mean. The White House context matters in ways that press releases don't fully explain. The National Security Council is not a department with a staff. It is the mechanism through which the President of the United States makes national security decisions, a structured interagency process that brings together the highest levels of state, defense, CIA, and the other national security institutions under the direct supervision of the President and his most senior advisors. When the NSC's Senior Director for Inter-American Affairs advises on Cuba policy, that advice directly shapes the framework within which the President and the Secretary of State operate. Rocha's specific period on the NSC, 1994 and 1995, the Clinton administration, a period of significant flux in U.S.-Cuba relations following the Cold War's end. The specific policy questions being evaluated at the NSC level during that period included the specific framework for American economic sanctions, the specific intelligence assessments of Castro's intentions and capabilities, the specific diplomatic openings that might or might not be pursued, and the specific American intelligence and law enforcement operations concerning Cuba. Rocha was advising on those questions while simultaneously being a reporting agent of the Cuban intelligence service that those questions were directly about. What's your red? When a Cuban intelligence asset is serving as the White House's senior director for inter-American affairs during a period of significant U.S.-Cuba policy deliberation, is the most serious damage to American national security the specific intelligence he transmitted, the policy advice he provided while serving two principals simultaneously, or something about the loss of American credibility with allies when this eventually became known? Type A if the transmitted intelligence is the primary damage. Type B if the corrupted policy advice is more consequential. Drop it in the comments. The FBI's operation began, by official account, when the Bureau received information suggesting that Russia might be a Cuban intelligence asset. The specific source of that information is not in any public filing, whether it was a signals intelligence lead, a human source in the Cuban intelligence service, an analytical assessment from a damage review, or something else entirely is in the classified portion of the investigation. That classified portion will not be unsealed. What was unsealed? The undercover operation. An FBI agent, presenting himself as a Cuban DGI official, reached out to Rocha via WhatsApp on November 15, 2022. He identified himself as Miguel and described himself as representing the Cuban intelligence service. Rocha could have reported the contact. Rocha could have gone to law enforcement. Rocha could have declined. He engaged. Across multiple meetings in Miami in 2022 and 2023, Rocha met with Miguel in recorded conversations that produced the most extensive, self-incriminating record in any Cuban espionage case in American history. He described his 40 years of service. He called it more than a grand slam. He described what he had provided, what he had protected, what specific American operations and officials his reporting had affected. He expressed specific contempt for the country he had represented. You do something for 40 years, and he told Miguel. It gives you kind of a sense of purpose, and there's no gold watch at the end of it. A sense of purpose. 40 years of serving Cuba by betraying America, described as a source of personal meaning in a recorded conversation with an FBI agent who was transcribing every word. He was arrested December 4, 2023 at his home in Miami. He was 73 years old. He had been serving Cuba since 1973 when he was 23, freshly graduated from Yale in Chile during the coup that killed Salvador Allende. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what specific intelligence Rocha provided during his year on the National Security Council, and what the classified damage assessment says about what Cuba's intelligence service was able to do with real-time access to American Cuba policy deliberations, is the Zagadka that 15 years in prison does not open to the public. The full damage caused by Rocha's decades-long covert relationship with Cuba may never be fully known. That sentence from federal prosecutors at the sentencing hearing is the most significant statement the case produced, not the 15 years, not the $500,000 fine. The acknowledgement that 40 years of access to American diplomacy, intelligence, and policy, including a year at the center of the NSC's inter-American policy process, produced consequences whose scope could not be fully calculated. 40 years, the specific postings Rocha held: the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, where he served twice, including as Deputy Chief of Mission; Havana, the U.S. interest section in Cuba, where the American diplomatic presence in the country he was secretly serving was his assignment; La Paz, Bolivia, where he served as U.S. ambassador, having been nominated by President Clinton and confirmed by the United States Senate. After the State Department, a position as advisor to the commander of U.S. Southern Command, the military command whose jurisdiction covers Cuba from 2006 to 2012. Military strategy, force posture, and the specific intelligence picture of the military command responsible for the American military's posture toward Latin America, including Cuba, available to a Cuban intelligence agent for an additional 6 years after retirement. The total 51 years from 1973 to his December 2023 arrest, the longest confirmed period of active foreign intelligence service by any American government official in the public record. You've seen the full picture. Recruited in Chile 1973, naturalized 1978, While already a Cuban agent, State Department 1981, NSC Senior Director 1994-95, advising on Cuba policy, Ambassador to Bolivia 2000-02, Southcom Advisor 2006-12, FBI undercover Miguel, November 2022, recorded as enemy and more than a grand slam, arrested December 2023, 15 years sentenced April 2024, Denaturalization filed May 2026. What single detail most defines the scope of the damage? Comment below. The denaturalization. In May 2026, the Department of Justice filed a civil complaint in federal court seeking to strip Rocha of his American citizenship. The legal theory, he was never eligible for naturalization. In 1978, when he took the oath of citizenship, he swore under oath that he was not affiliated with communist organizations, did not support communism, and believed in the principles of the United States Constitution. He was already a Cuban intelligence agent. The oath was, from the moment it was delivered, a lie. If the denaturalization proceeding succeeds, if a federal court agrees that the 1978 naturalization was void because it was obtained through fraud, Rocha's citizenship would be stripped. Not just his freedom, but his legal standing as an American. The sentencing produced 15 years. The denaturalization proceeding is trying to produce something more complete, the undoing of the citizenship that the lie created. These investigations, FBI Miami Field Office coordinating with the CIA, the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service, and the DOJ National Security Division, represent the specific counterintelligence work that identifies foreign penetration at the most senior levels of American diplomacy and policy. If this level of detail is what you come here for, a thumbs up is the best way to support this work. Was this justice? 15 years for the longest confirmed penetration of the American government by a foreign intelligence service, including a year advising on Cuba policy at the NSC and assignments as Deputy Chief of Mission in Buenos Aires and as U.S. Ambassador to Bolivia? Or does the statutory maximum available for the charge Rocha pleaded to represent a ceiling that doesn't reflect the 51-year scope and the unknown but potentially enormous damage? Drop your verdict in the comments. One detail, the one that no sentencing document and no press release addresses. The NSC meetings in 1994 and 1995, the specific conversations about Cuba policy that Victor Manuel Rocha participated in, the specific intelligence assessments he reviewed, the specific diplomatic options he advised on, the specific American operations and sensitivities that the NSC's Inter-American Affairs process made available to him. All of it is classified. None of it is in the public record. The sentencing document describes the access without describing the use. The damage assessment describes the uncertainty without describing the known damage. The public record acknowledges that 40 years of service at the most senior levels of American diplomacy produced unknown but potentially enormous consequences, and stops there. The NSC meetings in 1994 and 1995 are in the classified archives. Whatever Rocha reported from them is in Cuba's intelligence records. What Cuba did with what Rocha reported is in neither. BUHO is 75. He is serving 15 years at FCI Coleman in Florida. The sense of purpose he described to Miguel is in a federal evidence file. The damage his 51 years of purpose produced is in a classified assessment that the public record says may never be fully known. What stays with you? The NSC year, 1994-95, advising on Cuba policy while reporting to Cuba. The enemy, the word he used for America across 51 years of serving it, the more than a grand slam, his own assessment of what his 40 years delivered, or may never be fully known. The official acknowledgement that the sentence doesn't capture the full accounting? Let's discuss it below. One more number, the one the case record contains that frames the specific institutional trust violation in a single figure. 200 letters. That is how many letters of support Judge Virginia Kendall received before sentencing Ed Burke, the Chicago alderman case, from prominent officials and ordinary citizens testifying to his good works over 50 years. Victor Rocha received no such letters. He received no constituency of supporters writing to explain what his service had meant. because the 40 years of service that defined him were service to Cuba. The work he was doing, the meetings he was attending, the relationships he was maintaining, the information he was providing, was not in the service of the people he represented, the institution he worked for, or the country he had sworn an oath to. Whatever good Victor Rocha may have done in his official capacity as a diplomat, whatever genuine professional work he performed in the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Havana, and La Paz, was simultaneously being used as a cover for the work he was actually doing, the career built to conceal the mission to betray the career. No letters, no constituency of people whose lives he had genuinely improved through genuine service. The people whose lives he might have genuinely served through 40 years of diplomacy had their representatives' attention diverted to a foreign government whose interests were specifically opposed to theirs. 15 years, no letters, the specific silence of accountability without a mitigating chorus. That silence is the Zagadka's companion. BUHO had 40 years, Cuba had his service. America had a diplomat who was not, in the specific sense that matters, a diplomat. The NSC meetings are classified, the damage is partially unknown, the 15 years is running, and the denaturalization complaint is in a federal court in Florida, seeking to undo the 1978 oath that was a lie from the moment it was delivered. What stays with you? Share it below.